Thank you very much for that interaction. So we're going to have the next presenter, and that is Dr. Haneefa. She's going to be talking about addressing mental health to improve PrEP engagement, insights from women who use drugs, mental health providers, and outreach workers in Tanzania. Dr. Haneefa has a PhD, MPH, and is an associate professor of Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. And her interests are in marginalized populations, looking at improvement of their prevention and treatment access for those marginalized populations. So thank you very much and welcome for the presentation.
Thank you so much. I'm very honored to be here and to share the stage with the awardees and also the other presenters. Today I'm going to be talking about our work in Tanzania, focused on addressing mental health to improve PrEP engagement, looking at insights from women who use drugs, mental health providers, and peer outreach workers in Tanzania. Before I start the talk, I do want to acknowledge that I'm presenting on behalf of my research team, which includes researchers and also people with living and lived experience of drug use. We have a community advisory board composed of women who use drugs. We also have a study advisory board comprised of women with lived experience of drug use, but also representatives from the Ministry of Health, the Drug Control and Enforcement Agency, and health providers. And this is funded by NIDA. So why does this matter? Women who use drugs are being left behind in HIV prevention. In Tanzania, women who use drugs showed a disproportionate burden of HIV in the country. 35% of women who use drugs in Tanzania are estimated of living with HIV, compared to 6% of women nationally. And they face multiple overlapping risks of drug use, gender-based violence, poverty, and stigma and discrimination. Oops. Yet, despite these vulnerabilities, women who use drugs remain the least likely to actually access PrEP or other HIV prevention programs. So we were interested in this potential missing link between mental health and HIV prevention. So we know from our prior work in Tanzania that women who use drugs experience significant psychological distress, including depression, anxiety, and trauma, and not just trauma at the time of the study, but trauma that accumulates across the lifespan. In a survey that we conducted with women who used drugs back in 2019, we found that 68% of those women presented with symptoms that were consistent with major depression, and 44% presented with symptoms that would be considered generalized anxiety. And we know from the literature that mental disorders are known barriers to HIV prevention, including PrEP engagement. So for this study, we really wanted to center the voices of women and also the people who provide women with care and services. And we were interested in answering 3 specific research questions. So the first question was, what are the primary sources of mental health vulnerability experienced by women who use drugs? In what ways does mental distress influence HIV prevention, including PrEP engagement? So thinking about the mechanisms through which mental health influences PrEP. And then finally, rather than just focusing on vulnerabilities, we were very much interested in trying to understand the key sources of resilience that support women who use drugs to maintain mental well-being and engage in HIV prevention behaviors. This study was set in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. It is the main urban center in Tanzania. And we conducted in-depth interviews with 30 women who use drugs. We conducted 4 focus groups with women who use drugs, peer outreach workers, and also mental health providers. We also conducted key informant interviews with representatives from community-based and civil society organizations that provide harm reduction services and other services for women who use drugs and other vulnerable women. And we did a thematic analysis. So now I'm going to present the findings from our work. Women who use drugs reported facing significant stressors daily within their lives and across their lifespan, including childhood adversity, which included the death of a parent during childhood or abuse during one's childhood, economic marginalization, not only at the time of the study, but marginalization across their lifespan. Caregiving challenges was a huge source of stress for some women, particularly those women who had their children forcibly removed from them. Housing insecurity was not only a source of mental distress, but also had implications, which we will talk about in terms of like PrEP engagement. Violence was prevalent, and I'm not just talking about interpersonal violence, but I'm also talking about structural violence and how that sort of manifests in terms of policing practices and incarceration. And then intersecting stigma was a huge source of mental distress and a huge source of mental vulnerability among women who use drugs. And women reported stigma not only due to their drug use, but also due to sort of gender stigma because they are women. But also there was a lot of women within our study who were also engaged in sex work, so reporting experiencing stigma also because of their engagement in sex work. So I really wanted to bring the voice of the women within this presentation, and this quote sort of hits on some of the challenges that this one particular woman experienced as a child and how it still affects her today. She said, "It affected me a lot. It put me in a lot of stress because my father was no longer with me. He didn't need me anymore. He didn't take care of me anymore. He left my mother, didn't answer our calls, and I haven't seen him since. That's what pains me the most and confuses me every day." And this happened to her when she was just a child, and the woman was 32 years old, and she continued to talk about this when we asked her about some of the main stressors within her life. So mental health vulnerabilities, they manifested in several ways. We heard earlier the talk about sort of this internalization of stigma, anxiety, this constant worry, depression, which was described in terms of like hopelessness and suicide ideation, social isolation, both sort of voluntary social isolation, but also imposed social isolation based on rejection within the community, and coping through more harmful substance use. And so here's a quote from another woman. "You might think as a woman using drugs, if I weren't using drugs, I'd be with my family now, taking care of my children, doing what other women do. You tend to have a lot of thoughts." And there was a lot of talk among women about this sort of constant worrying, this having lots and lots of thoughts. And this was in particular related to some of the judgment that this woman faced as a mother and not being viewed as being able to take care of her child. So I'm going to go into this relationship between PrEP and mental health. And again, we talked to both women who use drugs, but also providers and peer outreach workers. And I should say at the start that unfortunately, many of the women who were in our study, this was their first time actually learning about PrEP, which sort of suggests to me that there are opportunities for improving our outreach, improving our demand generation for PrEP, especially within this community. Healthcare providers and peer outreach workers talked specifically about more institutional factors in terms of mental health and PrEP. They focused on the fragmented service delivery, the lack of integration of mental health services. Peer outreach workers in particular mentioned that they have that, sort of one-on-one interaction with women constantly, but they're not necessarily particularly trained in addressing mental health crises or responding to any mental health conditions that women are presenting with. Diminished motivation for HIV prevention and adherence can stem from sort of the underlying burden of mental illness. Housing insecurity not only exacerbates mental distress, but can have direct implications on one's ability to uptake and use PrEP and desire for psychosocial support and counseling. And I'll talk a little bit more about the last three. the 2 minutes that I have. So diminished motivation for HIV prevention. This is a quote from one of the women within our study. When a person reaches that point, it means they've lost hope. Whether they eat or not, take care of the family or not, it does not matter. It's the state of neglecting oneself. So participants often linked untreated mental illness to this diminished motivation for HIV prevention. Housing insecurity was not only a source of anxiety and excessive worrying, but also viewed as an impediment to PrEP. So here we have 2 quotes from 2 different women, sort of highlighting this housing insecurity and also their mobile lifestyles. So our homes are often just hangout spots where I sleep. There's no bag, there's nothing, it's just a mat on the floor, so it becomes difficult for me to have pills there. So not having a stable housing could make it difficult to store PrEP pills. And I should say at this time, oral pills are the only ones that are sort of in circulation within Tanzania. Another woman talked about the movement that she has throughout her daily days, which makes it challenging for her to take her medications. You may have withdrawal symptoms, and since I'm in Kigamboni, which is down near the water, the pills are in Ubungo, which is much farther away. I'll think I'll take them tomorrow, but by then I've already encountered a challenge. So this mobility within their lives makes it a lot more challenging for PrEP, in their opinion. Women repeatedly emphasize that counseling and emotional support are either lacking or inaccessible to them, and highlighted the need for psychosocial support and counseling. This woman said, if there were people having such conversations, providing education, talking, then a moment will come when you sit down, reflect, you think, why don't I start afresh? And finally, I want to talk about sources of resilience. So women talked about religion and faith as a key source for them. And I won't read this quote, but it sort of highlights the role of faith within women's lives and how it can be leveraged. And I want to end on this sort of quote that talks about community support. It talks a little bit about the stigma that women have and sort of how they sort of band together. In this case, this woman said, women who use drugs are not accepted by society because even the places where they live, you can't stay. But for me, I think it's fine. You see that this is a place where people throw garbage because we live in abandoned housing. But for us, we see that our feelings are in a safe space, and it's the right place. We say that the society has already excluded us, so we cannot stay in society. So that's why you find yourself hiding in a place where you can't stay. But your thinking and your happiness is a place where you can meet your friends, be it happiness, be it pain. When you talk to each other, it becomes like therapy. So this highlights the potential role of peer support in supporting women, not just in terms of their mental health, but also in terms of their ability to engage in PrEP. So in conclusion, I just want to sort of highlight that addressing mental health may help to improve PrEP engagement among women who use drugs. It seems like there are still gaps in PrEP outreach and demand generation. But there are sort of community resilient assets in terms of peer support and faith that could be leveraged to improve mental health and also PrEP outcomes. And finally, that's a key theme in terms of trauma-informed care, but thinking about some of those strategies that could provide that psychosocial support for women and linking them to PrEP while leveraging peers to overcome some of these barriers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Saleem. I think in the interest of time, we'll maybe hold questions and encourage people to come and talk to you after the session, if that's okay. Okay, thank you so much again.